Hello, Mr. P here. In this lecture, we're going to talk about water and the specific properties that water has. This is another example within the IB syllabus in which structure dictates function. Okay, water has a specific or a pretty specific set of functions, and it's structured in a way that allows those functions to take place. Okay, so in this lecture, we're going to spend about 15 minutes hopefully talking about the properties of water and how water molecule is structured to give it those particular properties. Okay, and so the first thing we need to talk about is what it means to be polar. Water is a polar molecule, and just like other polar molecules, water has poles. The hydrogen side is partially positive, and the oxygen side is slightly negative. And so we need to understand or spend a little bit of time talking about why that side of the water molecule is positive and why this side of the water molecule is negative. And for that, we needed to look at or take a close look at the electrons. Okay, now we know that hydrogen is bound to oxygen covalently, and so this is a covalent bond. And inside the covalent bond, or within the covalent bond, is a sharing of electrons. And so these two electrons are being shared, but they're being shared unequally. They're actually closer or being more strongly pulled by the oxygen because oxygen is a larger atom. Just like in our solar system and planets, those objects in space that are larger have more mass and so therefore have more gravity. And so I know this isn't really a gravity example, but we can use that analogy to kind of help understand the pull that is being exerted to these particular electrons. Okay, so these electrons are being shared, but they're being shared unequally. Okay, and so it's really, really important for you to understand that unequal sharing is the basis, the premise for polarity. Okay, and so oxygen is sharing these electrons unequally. Notice that this distance is actually shorter than the distance, even though it's slight. Okay, it is a slight difference. It is a slight unequal sharing of those electrons, but they are in fact pulled a little closer to oxygen. Also, these electrons, because oxygen is bigger, spend more time around oxygen because it takes longer for those particular particles to travel around the orbitals around oxygen as opposed to traveling around the orbital that is around hydrogen. And so these electrons, while they're being pulled and shared unequally, these are also not spending as much time around hydrogen as they are oxygen. And so for both of those reasons, this end is said to be slightly negative and this end is said to be slightly positive. Okay, and so that's really, really important. We're going to revisit these partial charges in a little bit when we start talking about hydrogen bonding and how those electrons or how those bonds enable this particular molecule to have the properties that water has. Okay, so let's talk about what the repercussions of having this polar nature is on this particular molecule. And so the fact that water is polar allows water to attract to other polar or charged compounds, which is going to be important when we start talking about blood as a transport medium, the ability for water to dissolve like substances, the ability for water to suspend substances and move substances through animals and plants. All of these things are going to be talked about, and we're going to kind of expand on these. But water being polar is the first and most important physical property of this particular molecule. And so let's take a look at how this polar nature affects multiple molecules at the same time. Here we have four individual water molecules, and all four water molecules have the exact same shape, and they're just tumbling around space, filling up the container in which they're in. And you'll notice that they have their hydrogens towards one pole and the oxygen is towards the other pole. And again, water is polar, and so the fact that the hydrogens are all towards one pole and those electrons, like we talked about, spend more time around the oxygen, then it's going to give the oxygens that partial negative charge, and the hydrogens are going to have that partial positive charge. And the interaction between the partial positive and the partial negative is going to give rise to hydrogen bonding. And those hydrogen bonds are going to form between a hydrogen of one molecule and an oxygen of another atom, okay, or another molecule. And so we're going to see these hydrogen bonds form. Notice that when these water molecules orient themselves they are going to create or start to create a lattice structure, and it's this lattice structure or these hydrogen bonds between adjacent molecules, one being hydrogen, one being oxygen. These are a rather weak bond, okay? And so we're going to say these are hydrogen bonds right here in yellow. Hydrogen bonds are a weaker bond. They are much weaker than the covalent bonds that are bonding the hydrogens to the oxygens within the same molecule. But it's these hydrogen bonds that form, that give water its cohesive and adhesive properties. Okay, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. I know you probably don't know anything about or much about the cohesive or adhesive properties of water, which is why you're watching this video. But we're going to talk about that. It is the hydrogen bondings that give rise to those particular properties within water. Okay, and those particular bonds, hydrogen bonds, form as a result of a interaction between the partial negative and the partial positive of two different water molecules. Okay, properties of water. We just talked about the cohesive and the adhesive properties of water as a result of hydrogen bonding, but cohesion is or results from water molecules sticking to water molecules. And so because water is polar, notice you can see over here in this image, there is a lattice structure that is forming between the partial positive, again, of one atom, okay, or one hydrogen atom within one water molecule, and the partial negative charge of the oxygen atom within another water molecule, forms this very weak hydrogen bond. Okay, cohesion, water molecules sticking to other water molecules. That is an example right here of cohesion. Okay, form hydrogen bonds and stick two polar water molecules together. Hydrogen bonds are, remember, weak, and there is a large number of them, as you can see here. When you have a bunch of water molecules taking up or creating gas or ice or liquid water, there is a ton of water molecules in that sample, and there's an even a similar number of hydrogen bonds, because again, all of those water molecules are sticking together. Okay, each water molecule bonds to four other water molecules, forming a tetrahedral arrangement and giving rise to this particular lattice structure. Okay, now not all of the hydrogen bonds are formed. Each water molecule can form up to 4 hydrogen bonds. It's called tetrahedral arrangement. Okay, now because of cohesion, there is a couple other properties that particular property gives rise to. One of them is surface tension. Many of you have probably seen things floating on water, and I'm not talking about boats. I'm talking about different insects, different leaves, stuff like that. Okay, when you really take a look, an in-depth look at surface insects or insects that can scurry across the surface of water, if you were to really look at and study their legs and the interaction between their leg and the water, you would notice that the water isn't actually penetrated at all. In fact, these insects or arachnids have tiny hairs that are extending off the feet of their legs, and those feet increase the surface area by which this leg strikes the water, and doesn't actually break the surface because the water is more strongly bonded to each other with these hydrogen bonds. Okay, the water molecules are more strongly bound to each other than the insect, or in this case the spider, is exerting to the water, and so the water surface doesn't break. Okay, the penetration or the surface of the water isn't penetrated. Okay, another example of that is when you see dewdrops or drops of water on leaves or a nicely waxed car. Those water molecules are sticking more closely together. Again, the water molecules inside that drop of water are bound to each other, and those hydrogen bonds are stronger than gravity is, pulling this potential drop of water into a flat sheet to cover the leaf surface. Okay, cohesive forces are at play, and they're essentially, the water molecules within this drop of water are all pulling more tightly together, and they want to create the smallest possible volume, which in fact is a sphere. And so you'll see those water droplets forming water droplets because, again, the hydrogen bonds are very strongly attracting the water molecules to each other and not the surface of the leaf, or in this case the surface of the bug. Okay, adhesion. Adhesion is another property of water, but adhesion is different than cohesion. Cohesion, remember, is water molecules sticking to water molecules. Adhesion occurs when water molecules stick to or form a hydrogen bond with something that is non-water. In this case, the water molecules are sticking to each other. That's cohesion. Okay, so cohesion and adhesion go hand in hand. Cohesion is keeping the water in the drop, okay, but adhesion is keeping the drop attached to the spider web in this case. Okay, adhesion is creating hydrogen bonds, or the fact that hydrogen bonds were created between the water molecules and the surface of the spider web, or the protein in the spider silk. And cohesion is keeping the water molecules tightly bound to a particular drop. Okay, adhesion keeping water molecules sticking to non-water things. Okay, water molecules tend to stick to other molecules that are charged or polar for similar reasons that they stick to each other. It is hydrogen bonding. Okay, hydrogen bonding stick like molecules together. In this case, water sticking to water. Again, partial positive to partial negative is cohesion. The ability for this water molecule to stick to a particular surface protein, in this case, would be adhesion. Okay? Adhesive forces are stronger than gravity and cause water droplets to stick to surfaces due to the large number of hydrogen bonds between molecules. There is a reason why these water molecules are stuck to this protein instead of being pulled to Earth's surface by gravity, and that's because the hydrogen bonds that are holding this water drop to this surface protein or this particular spider silk protein are stronger than the forces of gravity. So now, if we link adhesive and cohesive forces between water and its environment, you get a property called capillary action. Capillary action is the combination of adhesive and cohesive forces between water molecules, like these, and the particular environment in which they're living in, or in which they're not particularly living in, but within they're interacting in. Okay, this property is critical in the movement of water through plant vascular tissue. Okay, and so this is going to be our stand-in for plant xylem. Whoa. Okay, xylem. This would be our plant xylem. It is a plant vascular tissue vessel, if you will, that is used or utilized to transport water molecules against gravity from the root in the ground all the way through the trunk, branches, and then out of the leaf stomata in order for the plants to transport water all the way throughout the plant. Okay, plant cells make up the plant, and plant cells need water. Water is one of those fundamental molecules that gives life the ability to continue living, and so we need to get water molecules from the ground through plant vascular tissue to the leaf in order for the plant cell to function correctly. And so let's take a look at how these water molecules are going to move through this particular xylem vessel by using capillary action in concert with the adhesive and cohesive forces that these water molecules have based on hydrogen bonding. So remember, we talked about hydrogens having a partial positive charge, and because all of these hydrogens are partially positive, they're going to create interactions, or they're going to create a charge which is going to attract a partially negative, and the oxygen is going to be partially negative, and so the interactions between, or the attractiveness between, this partially negative charge and partially positive charge is going to create a hydrogen bond. And so we're going to have hydrogen bonds form between the oxygen and the hydrogens on each of the adjacent water molecules all the way up this vessel, making an entire or an entirely connected column of water. And so these water molecules are going to be pulled one after another up the vessel wall, through the root, the stem, the stalk, the leaf, and eventually are going to be expelled as water vapor as the plant transpires. But this is cohesion, okay, because it is water molecules sticking to water molecules. Adhesion comes into play between the interactions of this water molecule and the vessel wall itself. And so hydrogen bonds are going to be formed between the partial charges that exist between the molecule and the vessel wall itself. And so these particular charges are going to be adhesion, okay, or the adhesive forces. Okay, adhesion is when water molecules are sticking to non-water substances. Cohesion is when water is sticking to water. Both adhesion and cohesion play into the idea of capillary action, which is essentially a fancy way of saying water moving up a thin tube using hydrogen bonds. One of the other not so related to, or is related to, but is not so much capillary action, is when you have a column of water and you can visually see a meniscus. This could be, for instance, a graduated cylinder. When you fill a graduated cylinder with water, you're going to always notice that the water bends up the sides, and again, that is due to cohesion and adhesion. Okay, water obviously wants to pull water molecules up with it, but the water molecules also are being attracted to the sides of the container, and so they're sticking to the sides of the container even against gravity, because gravity is pulling on all of this water the same in a downward direction, but the adhesive forces that are acting on these water molecules are actually stronger than the gravity is in this case. Okay, so properties of water. Now, we obviously have talked about cohesion, we've talked about adhesion, we've talked about capillary action, we've talked about a meniscus, but one of the biggest or most beneficial properties of water is the fact that it acts as a solvent. I've heard it before, water referred to as the universal solvent. I don't know that I really agree with that particular statement. However, water is a very good solvent of organic and inorganic substances based on the polarity that it exhibits. And so it obviously, just like we said before, has partial positive charges and partial negative charges. The water molecule itself has not changed. The water molecules are going to orient themselves positive towards negative ions or atoms and negative towards positive atoms or ions. Okay, and so you can see here we've got positive hydrogens interacting with this negative chlorine ion or chloride ion, and you have the negative oxygens interacting with or attracted to the positive potassium chloride or the potassium ion. Okay. When you drop a solid substance like this potassium chloride into a solvent like water, the water molecules are instantly going to kind of break the hydrogen bonds between themselves and are going to create hydrogen bonds between the partially negative charge of the ion and the partially positive charge of the water molecule, or vice versa, with the partially negative charge of the oxygen and the partially positive charge of this particular ion. Okay, these water molecules are going to keep this particular ion suspended and keep this ion from attaching itself to this solid mass, which gives the illusion, okay, and I don't know if I should call it illusion, but it gives the appearance that this solid has disappeared because it is not in solid state anymore. It is actually broken apart and is held as individual ions, but is still in the solution itself. Okay, positive atoms are going to be surrounded by negative oxygen regions, and the negative atoms are going to be surrounded by positive hydrogen regions. Again, just like I said, negative attaches to and is attracted to positive, and the positive is attracted to and attaches to the negative. Okay. The solvent property of water is really important because there are a lot of cases throughout the IB syllabus and throughout biology in general where diffusion and transport across membranes or across liquids are really, really important in terms of moving solutes around cells. And one of the ways that the cell is so efficient at moving materials, whether it be facilitated diffusion or regular diffusion, is that it suspends the nutrients and the needed materials in water, which makes it easier for diffusion to take place. Okay, so let's talk about the thermal properties of water. Thermal properties of water is really, really important and is one of the reasons why water is so stable. Okay, so I would put stability in with thermal properties of water. Okay, the fact that water has a very high specific heat capacity directly results in the stability of that particular substance. Now, we know from our past science classes and our past years of high school or middle school, we know that water has three states. We know that water has a solid state. We know that water has a liquid state, and we know that water has a gas or vapor state. Now you'll notice by these three diagrams, or these three pictures, that the liquid state is the most dense. Okay, the solid state is a little less dense, and the vapor state is probably, or is not probably, it is the most dense in terms of density. Okay, and we talk about density being basically the negative space, the space between the molecules themselves. And we could get into the chemistry and the properties, the physical properties, and we could talk a lot about the joules and the amount of energy that is kept constant and lost at each of the phases. But really, for the IB syllabus, the one thing I want you to know is that this high heat of vaporization, it is very, very important or critical for you to understand that water takes energy in order to break hydrogen bonds. Okay? Hydrogen bonds are fairly stable. The hydrogen bonds that are holding the individual molecules together require energy in order for those particular bonds to break. Okay? Now, it takes quite a bit of energy to break those. And so it stays stable or remains relatively stable until the maximum amount of energy is reached, at which point the bonds will break and the phase will change. Okay? Why is the thermal property of water so important? Well, when you get hot and your core body temperature increases to a relatively unsafe or an increasingly more unsafe temperature, your body is physiologically going to start sweating in order for you to lower your core body temperature. And so if this is the surface of your skin, when you sweat, you produce beads of water which are going to pull heat from your body very quickly, and the energy that is pulled in the form of heat is going to break the hydrogen bonds, releasing individual H2O molecules in the form of vapor, which is why sweat is a very good coolant. But it all has to do with this high specific heat capacity and high heat of vaporization. Okay, sweat is a good evaporant coolant because it requires heat in the form of body heat, which it pulls from cells or tissue, specifically skin cells, in order to break the bonds between the liquid water molecules to release them as vapor. Okay, another example would be a pond. Okay, it could be 100 degrees outside for a month straight, and the pond water will not reach 100 degrees, which is vital to the aquatic life that's living in it, because their enzymes would denature. They would have a lot of problems surviving in an environment that's 100 degrees. But the fact that water remains relatively stable during this liquid phase, okay, it takes a lot of energy to raise the temperature of water 1 degree. Okay, this is the specific amount of energy. I don't know that you necessarily need to know that. Just know that water remains stable until a large amount of energy. It can absorb a large amount of energy before it really changes either states or temperatures. Okay, let's erase this so you can read. Okay, so we've talked a lot about properties, and all of these properties are due to the large amounts of hydrogen bonds. We've talked in depth about what those hydrogen bonds are, where they're at, how they're formed, and those hydrogen bonds need to be formed or broken in order to change the temperature of or the state of water. And water is used by plants and animals as a coolant to combat overheating. I talked about how sweating is the result of combating high core body temperatures, because if your core body temperature increases to an unsafe level, the proteins in your body and in the cells that make up your body and in the cells that make up your body tissues are going to start denaturing. Now, I know we haven't really talked about protein denaturation yet, but we will in future videos. In fact, in about 4 videos, there's going to be a protein discussion or a protein video that talks in depth about what protein denaturation is and the potential issues it causes to those enzymes that are involved in some of the critical processes that make up biology. Okay, so now that we've talked about properties of water, we're going to talk a little bit about what hydrophilic and hydrophobic means. Okay, water is a polar molecule, and so hydrophilic as a definition means that it, or if we look at prefix suffix, philic means love or attracted to. Hydro is obviously water or H2O, and so these are essentially the water-loving or the water-attracted to or the attracted to water, water-liking, water-loving molecules. And so these are substances that are chemically attracted to water, and in order to be chemically attracted to water, they too need to be polar. Polar is something you can remember. Polar attracts or likes other polar molecules. Okay? The fact that water molecules have the partial positive and the partial negative make it really good at attracting itself to other polar molecules that have these unequal distributions of charges. Okay, if we look at ammonia, NH3 for instance, this is going to be a partial positive, partial positive, partial positive, partial negative. Water molecule can attach itself here or form a hydrogen bond here between this hydrogen and this nitrogen. Okay, again, this is a partial positive, this is a partial negative. It can form a hydrogen bond. And so polar can attract to other polar molecules. Okay, that is hydrophilic, and these are interactions between polar molecules. Okay, hydrophobic is the exact opposite. Phobic or phobia means fear. Hydro again means water, and so these are water molecules, or these are molecules that fear or incapable of attracting to water, and so they repel water. Okay, they are insoluble or repel water. An example of that would be oil. I think everybody has added oil to water before, and it's a pretty cool phenomena, right? Oil, because it's less dense, is going to sit as a mass on top of the water, and it is not going to interact with water at all, and so it's going to create this really clean, distinct separation between the two substances. That is because oil is hydrophilic, or hydrophobic rather, and water is hydrophilic. If you were gonna, give it that title, but more realistically, we just say water is polar, and oil in this case is non-polar. Non-polar does not attract itself to polar substances. Polar substances attract themselves to other polar substances. Okay. Nonpolar molecules are said to be hydrophobic because they do not have an unequal distribution of charges. In fact, they have equal distribution of charges. Lipids are examples of hydrophobic molecules, okay? And within these within this lipid class of biomolecules, fats, oils, cholesterol, waxes, steroids, etc. fit into that class. And just like proteins, we're going to have a video discussion on what lipids are as well. Okay. Now, when we talked about the property of water that is a solvent, one of the applications of that solvent discussion, or that solvent property, is the idea of blood plasma. Now, we know that blood plasma consists of the majority of blood plasma is water. Okay, the majority of your water, or the majority of your body in general, is water, but the majority of blood is water, and we dissolve things into that blood to create this blood plasma, which is a very nutrient and very substance-rich slurry of molecules. And I want to go through some of the things that are found in blood plasma and how they interact with the water in blood plasma in order to actually be a part of that blood plasma. Okay, so one of the reasons, or one of the substances within blood plasma, are amino acids. Amino acids are the monomer of proteins. Okay, so these amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. We obviously need these amino acids in our bloodstream because we always need to produce proteins. So we're going to kind of flood all of our enzymes with amino acids so that proteins can be built. Glucose is freely soluble in blood. A lot of times you hear blood glucose concentration or blood glucose level. That comes into play if you're diabetic, or if you're not diabetic. You obviously have blood or glucose in your blood. Okay, it is the main energy source for the cells. Okay, the blood is freely soluble, or the glucose is freely soluble in the blood. It's going to travel to all the cells and be used in the cell respiration pathway in order to produce ATP. Okay, so glucose becomes ATP, but it is freely soluble in the blood. Amino acids have positive and negative charges based on the carboxyl and amino groups. So you'll notice that this is the amino group. It has a positive charge, and the carboxyl group has a negative charge. Now I'm not going to get into the actual anatomy of the amino acid because that's a later video, but just know that it has a positive and a negative charge. Negative is on the carboxyl end, the positive is on the amino end. Okay. Now the R group, which can be seen essentially as a side chain from the main carbon, has a various charge or polarity. Okay, the R group, again, we're not going to go through the anatomy of this right now, but for the purposes of polarity and the discussion for this particular topic, the R groups can be polar, nonpolar, charged, either negative or positive. Okay, and so these are going to be interacting with the water molecules like we talked about in previous slides. Oxygen is a nonpolar molecule. It is soluble, though, due to the very small size. So because it is essentially just a molecule made up of two atoms, it is very small. It is soluble based on size alone. Now, I know I've in previous slides said that nonpolar molecules are typically not soluble in water because water is polar and polar attracts other polar substances, but size plays a role in solubility as well, and because this is just a two-molecule or two-atom molecule, it remains soluble. However, there is a molecule that is required to transmit oxygen to and from the cell, and that molecule is in the form of an enzyme. That enzyme is specifically located within the red blood cells, and at body temp, it is required to transfer oxygen from the lungs through the blood to the cell in order to transmit that oxygen to the mitochondria in order for cell respiration to take place. Okay, this enzyme is also equally important in getting carbon dioxide, a waste gas, from the red blood cells back to the lungs in order for kind of that entire respiration pathway to be maintained. Okay, now we're going to focus on a different kind of class of organic molecules, and all of them are required to be a component of blood. They are beneficial in a lot of ways, but they are all, I say all, both fats and cholesterol are both nonpolar molecules. Okay, nonpolar triglyceride. Again, triglyceride is a three-tailed or three fatty acid lipid, and they are very large molecules. They are repeating carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. They are insoluble in water due to the nonpolar nature of that particular protein. They will not readily dissolve or interact with water molecules. In fact, they are hydrophobic, and so both the triglycerides and cholesterol are both hydrophilic and require kind of a complex protein, lipoprotein, in the form of this. Okay, this is what it looks like. It is a kind of a lipid-bound bubble in which we put hydrophobic triglycerides and cholesterol in, and these phospholipids, being polar on the outside and non-polar on the inside, give a nice environment in order, or kind of act as a buffer zone in order for us to successfully house and store these fats, which would otherwise be insoluble in water. Okay. Lipoproteins are, like I said, a single layer of phospholipids. I know we haven't talked specifically about the anatomy of phospholipids, that will come, but they have a polar head and they have non-polar tails, and so non-polar interactions can interact with the non-polar or hydrophobic triglycerides and cholesterol that inhabit the center of this. Polar obviously is going to interact with the water that is the main component of the blood, and because we have kind of this single layer of phospholipids that give a kind of a nice, suitable home, if you will, for these triglycerides, it allows them to stay separate all the time from the blood and the water. Okay? So, cholesterol are positioned in the phospholipid membrane. You can specifically see them here. That's a cholesterol, that's a cholesterol, that's a cholesterol. Cholesterol molecules maintain structural integrity or structural rigidity to membranes, and the triglycerides would be contained within the inside of that particular bubble. Okay, and I keep calling it a bubble only because that's kind of an analogy. It's an easy way to remember, but it is a lipoprotein complex. Its job is to serve as a boundary, if you will, for the fats that would otherwise be insoluble in blood. And the last thing we need to talk about as a major component to blood plasma is, or are the sodium ions, or specifically the sodium and chlorine ions. So NaCl is a compound that makes up salt. We know NaCl to be salt, and salt is a component of blood plasma. Salt, because of the solvent nature of water, is going to be split from the compound into individual ions. Again, just like we talked about, sodium is going to be positively charged, chlorine is going to be negatively charged, and the oxygen, being slightly negative, is going to attach itself to the positive ion of sodium, and the opposite, positively charged hydrogen ions, are going to interact with the negatively charged chlorine ion, and the water molecule is going to keep these particular ions separate, and so they are going to dissolve them in blood. Now, they are freely soluble in water because of the solvent nature of blood, specifically the solvent nature of water. Okay, but it's going to keep those ions separate. And like we talked about a couple slides ago, one of the coolest properties of water is definitely the latent heat of evaporation. Remember, it requires, or water requires, a lot of energy in order to evaporate. And so when water is on the surface of skin, it requires heat, or requires energy in the form of heat, to change this liquid water into gas water. And basically, water is going to, or sweat, is going to pull the heat from the surface of the skin, release gas water in the form of vapor, and because it is pulling the heat or wicking the heat away, it is going to drop your core body temperature. If sweating was not possible, you would very quickly overheat in a lot of different activities and a lot of different environments. Okay, so why is cooling the body really important? Tissues, and specifically enzymes, are really, really susceptible to denaturing in relatively semi-hot temperatures. Okay, just changing the core body temp from 98.6 degrees to 100 or the low hundreds, 103, 105, could have lasting effects on the overall health of the specific proteins that are denatured at that temperature. Okay, the ability for you to transport oxygen, the ability for you to contract muscles, the ability for you to send neuron impulses, all require enzymes, and those enzymes have to function properly. And in order for them to function properly, you have to maintain a constant internal condition. It's called homeostasis. If we change that temperature or change that environment enough, or deviate from the normal, then the temperature is going to, or then those enzymes are going to denature and render them useless. That is really, really important and really, really bad for you. Okay, again, water is a relatively stable molecule and requires a lot of energy to change temperatures, meaning it will heat and cool more slowly than air and land, which is really, really important when we talk about using it as an evaporative coolant. Okay, again, that is sweat. One of the last things we need to do is compare the characteristics of methane and water. This is a methane molecule, and this is a water molecule. Okay, and so if we look at those particular molecules, we are going to notice a couple of different things. One, this methane molecule has 3 hydrogens, or 4 rather, attached to the center carbon, and the water molecule has 2 hydrogens attached to the center oxygen. This molecule is polar, and the methane molecule is nonpolar. What does that mean? It means the water molecule has uneven distribution of charges. This one is partially negative, and this end is partially positive. Okay? Over here, the methane, this end is partially positive, this end is partially positive, this end is partially positive, this end is partially positive. You can't find an area on the methane molecule that is partially negative because it is nonpolar. It has an equal distribution of charges throughout the entire molecule. Water molecule is the opposite. Okay, so that's the main or the biggest difference. Okay, they're both bonded with single covalent bonds. Okay, the hydrogens are bound by a single covalent bond. They have a slightly different specific heat capacity. Okay, which is really, really important to key in on. They have a very different latent heat of vaporization, and notice they have very different melting and boiling points. But basically, all of these within water show or point to a very stable molecule that is very good at absorbing a lot of heat. Methane, not so much. Okay? Which is why when we talk about global warming, or we talk about environmental temperatures and environmental temperature change, water vapor is kind of one of those greenhouse gases, but it is not a very prolific, if that's a word, greenhouse gas or concern, because of the relatively stability that it has as a molecule. Okay, I think that's where we're going to end it. If you have questions, bring them to class. See ya.